Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Going into the War Within, they made really big changes to Mythic Plus, and Challenger's Peril being one of them. I think they really have missed the mark in terms of what they're actually kind of doing to the player base in the process. So in Dragonflight, there were a lot of times, especially Season 3 and Season 4, running with some of the Exodia comps that you had there, you could really like steamroll keys up into pretty high levels without really respecting a lot of the dungeon mechanics. And so, as they even write right here, they want Challenger's Peril to emphasize precise play and greater risk on player decisions as they progress through higher keystone levels. So they say, hey, we want to give you some breathing room, not make it as punishing, but we still want this initial goal of precise play to come into effect. Now, the issue is that in Dragonflight, you didn't have this penalty and you could rack up like 20-something deaths in certain dungeons and still time it, which felt really weird for a timed event, especially with runbacks involved as well. But a lot of people really enjoyed being able to kind of like steamroll keys up until they got into a high level. The problem was that you would have a really huge mix of players where you didn't really understand if this person with this IO or this person with the same IO actually knew the dungeon mechanics. And so what they've built in the War Within is like this big wall, especially at 12s, where the health, the damage are all really high, which makes the players have to be even better at their classes, even better at their specs, really in order to make it over this wall, in order to really progress. But because of the infinite nature of spamming Mythic Plus, where as long as you can find a keystone, you can just keep on playing the game, you don't really have that improvement that Blizzard's trying to force upon the player base. You kind of just have people smashing face into the dungeons, and as players continue to improve, they also get a lot more exclusive. So way back in Legion, when Mythic Plus first came around, on NA, there was a pretty vibrant Discord community that was really looking to like get people together to start doing Mythic Plus dungeons. And then over time, that community basically just fell apart because people started getting more and more exclusive. Before the 0.1% title really came along, people realized that there was, a handful of the total player base that they could progress into the highest dungeons. And so it became more about getting onto people's friends lists and getting into that networking to find those elite groups to continue sort of progressing. Now, that kind of got broken up into a bunch of different tiers, not just in the 0.1%, but also in like the 1%, where people would very rarely want to like pug somebody. They'd very rarely want to pug somebody, only kind of play with their friends, and more people started kind of shifting to that over time. This is kind of what's happening right now in the War Within Season 1, from what I've seen, is that dungeons over 12 are having not huge amounts of people looking around in groups in LFG, and you're having a lot of players really just getting like slammed at that 12 level, and it might change a little bit thanks to this Challenger's Peril affix, but I think a lot of people get like really hard gated at the 12 because of the jump up in difficulty and the fact that the game doesn't really teach you how to get better. There's three main factors that you really have to balance in dungeons over 12s. That's doing enough damage, especially with the tank nerfs that were kind of put in this expansion. Tanks don't live forever. They have incredible tankiness. But, when I play with VDH, there's times where if the pack doesn't die in X amount of time as we're trying to do a pull, that he will just melt, right? Or he has to be forced to kite or something along those lines. The damage checks get really high, especially as you start ramping up in keys over 12. The healing checks ramp up very quickly, as I'm sure a lot of you have noticed from our channel, especially when you're pugging in cast go through. And the third factor is the crowd control element. And so all of these things really get pushed upon you as you go into higher level dungeons. And I would argue, since the War Within has put together, or actually Dragonflight, to be honest, has put together all these talent nodes, we have more abilities really than ever before that we have to take advantage of. You have things like kick, obviously, but it used to be that healers didn't actually have kicks. You have all of the crowd control, thunderstorms, stuns. You have a variety of dispel formats that you have to master, and a lot of these are not new, but having all of these together is also having Blizzard balance around having all of these things. For example, I know this is HPS logs, but the range is really what I want to highlight for some of these Warcraft log statistics, is that, you'll see specs like Disc Priest have incredibly wide ranges. Things like Totemic Shaman have widely been viewed as easier to play, so they have a little bit of a smaller range. But we never really get data to show the range with which people use their kicks, their stuns, their interrupts, their defensives. There's not these statistics on these things, but it really only takes you pugging a couple of times to realize that there is an incredibly massive delta between people who are using those abilities and people who are not. And since Blizzard designs the game around them regardless, you can have some enormously frustrating experiences. Just like in our previous videos where we've talked about the problems with healing in Dragonflight being based off of having so many defensives that you basically have to have a defensive up for every major mechanic in order to survive, so too is the game being designed around all of the additional crowd control that continues to get added over time. Having more resources than ever to unlock all these abilities also means that Blizzard wants to challenge players and make it so that they have to use every single ability in order to make sure you're having more successful runs, or just about, or having like almost all of the people taking advantage of those things. And what you really have noticed over time is that there's not a really good way for the game to teach people how to utilize these mechanics. For example, we had like the Exile's Reach as new players are sort of getting into the game, but since it's not involved in endgame content, a lot of people were just kind of skipping ahead, boosting ahead, and then just progressing on throughout the regular game. I'd also argue since Delves have existed, they've sort of made a progression path more focused towards casual players, and the Mythic Plus and like raid environments are really focused towards what I would call competitive players. Like, I think in general, a lot of casual players are going to play the game a lot. They might even play as much as competitive Mythic Plus or competitive raid players might, but their emphasis is going to be not so much on let me push out as much damage, as much healing, as much whatever. They still want to improve their gear, right? But there's a different mindset that they have going on. And as a result, since you kind of diverge those player bases a little bit more when it comes to gear progression, in my opinion, it seems like the changes they've been making to Mythic Plus has been that they feel more comfortable adding on more difficulty into these dungeons, just like how the raid devs are consistently making raids more challenging. And I think Nerebar Palace is a really good example of how the raids have gotten steadily more difficult over time. So while we're well into the season right now, I think what we're really going to be looking for is how the difficulty of dungeons continues to sort of branch out. And one of the largest levels of difficulty is just finding a group to begin with that can press their buttons well. And I think the more that you're having the continued sort of bloat with lots of cooldowns, lots of crowd control, lots of defensives, the wider of a range of players that you're really going to be experiencing. And it's also going to start, I believe, turning people off to the game when they start feeling like their progression gets stopped. Now, you might have an entire wide range of player base, and then, you have a fraction of people who are doing 15s and up right now, a little bit larger of a chunk here that's doing 12s, and then you kind of have like the rest of the player base. But what you forget is we're naturally increasing an item level every single week, probably for the next like month and a half until people start getting close to BIS. And as a result, as people get closer to BIS, they're naturally going to progress further in towards 12s. But because the wall is going to be so high with doing 12s, the execution checks are going to be so high, it's going to be a real bear, I think, for a lot of players who want to have steady progression and to be able to continuously overcome things, which is a positive for having a slower gearing process. It's also going to be a negative if the wall itself is so large and the game doesn't do enough to really prepare you for what you're going to experience. For strong players, they're going to continuously look inwards, look towards their friends list, look towards networking, and be less willing to take on unknown people. And for people trying to rise through the groups, well, there's just going to be less groups available doing those 12s, 13s, and onwards, in my opinion, than we've seen previously. That's probably my biggest concern, is that when they rise up with that difficulty, players are sort of adapting in a variety of different ways. And part of that is making sure you have really quality control checks as to who you're bringing in with your team, becoming more exclusive. And that's really where you've seen a lot of the issue with the invite protests that we had a couple weeks ago, was that people didn't feel like they were getting invited. Now, part of that is definitely related to spec balance and how much damage specs do, where some specs are just absolutely crushing others, which naturally makes doing high keys significantly easier if you just kill off everything fast enough. You need less kicks, less defensives, all of that. But it also is going to be relating it to how willing are people to try new players out or try players out when, hey, this one person has significantly higher eye level. Okay, we're just going to be able to bring them in. We know what we're doing. Or people are just not going to be listening at all and then waiting for friends, waiting for network groups to be able to come on. And so, as I've been saying, the issue is really that they've made these affixes going into the new expansion to be more punishing and to force more precise gameplay upon people before they're going to be able to progress. But the game itself doesn't do much to teach you how to use these resources effectively. The difference between using a damage reduction cooldown before a hit, after a hit, in preparation of that damage is very, very different, and you know that firsthand as a healer. The amount of kicks, stops, interrupts required, and teaching people about how direct interrupts really are working, well, you need to use add-ons for these things. You need to use third-party resources to make sure you're tracking and understanding which of the mobs in 8 different dungeons are priorities, understanding what they do, the downsides of what they do, and it's incredibly brutal. It's a huge skill check for people going into it, and the game doesn't really teach you those things. So what should they be doing instead? Well, I really think, especially when it comes to interrupts, that they should be removing that direct interrupt where you need to actually use a wind shear, use a kick in order to stop a volley cast from going off, and that you should be able to use those AoE crowd control abilities once again. I think the crowd control has gotten really out of hand. The requirements have gotten really out of hand in dungeons, and the punishment is razor high when you're in these pub groups. You can't communicate all of these things unless you are in voice. A lot of players don't always want to get in voice, don't always want to communicate every single little thing that they're doing. They don't have that level of organization. And it very quickly becomes needed as you're doing dungeons past 12s. So sort of forcing it upon people makes it a lot harder. I don't really know why they don't have an affix which is actually accelerating the cast of mobs. Now hear me out, I know that sounds insane, but if you have a mob that has a cast time of 1.5 seconds, for example, why is it not like a 5-second cast at like keys below 6? And then at 6, it becomes what you would call the regular level of 1.5 seconds. Why do we not have like insanely slow casts in earlier level dungeons to give people time to see like, oh, that mob is casting. Oh, it might be lethal. Oh, I have to take time. Because really, as players are learning, their reaction times are slower. They're distracted by other things. They're still learning their specs. They're still understanding what's going on. Just having some beers and hanging out with friends. Why is that not actually allowing you to have a little bit more of an on-ramp? And they say, oh, okay, like, I don't know, past 6 or something, it's the regular sort of cast that they have going on. Better alerts or information really in the game itself to tell you about like the strengths or understanding of how you can use defensives. Because yeah, you could use a defensive like Astral Shift, which is a 40% damage reduction, but if you use it at a proper time, it's basically wasted, right? You know, you could mitigate half of a hit, or you can mitigate 1 or 2 dot ticks, but if you miss the rest of it, or you're already low health or something like that, it's really, really wasted. I think health in general needs to be a lot higher to give healers time to respond to what the burst damage is really doing to the dungeons. And I think we've already seen really big swings in overall healer output in just how you're playing one healer versus another. And that also plays a really big role in like how healer balance is going to be working, what sort of agency that healers have to heal through mistakes and make up for those mistakes that you can continue sort of progressing through those dungeons. I think what we have right now is a really like simple but brutal way of teaching people to play the game and to force upon them to get better. And for those who are not going to be as comfortable with it or don't have the time or desire to be going through lots of third-party sites and research and understanding all of this, because it's a freaking video game. It's crazy complicated. I don't think that they need to just like chop it down to 5-button rotations by any means, but you have to admit that WoW has gotten incredibly bloated with all of these resources, and when they design around it, it becomes even more challenging for people to get on and learn. But hey, this is just my opinion throughout this video, so let me know what you guys think about. Also, like, what challenges have you been experiencing throughout this Mythic Plus season? What I've really seen so far is it seems like there's less groups willing to start posting up in LFG as they start progressing in dungeons, and I think that it's only going to get more and more exclusive, especially at keys over 12s, to find groups and find that sort of community, which makes WoW a great game to play. And having so much coordination needed in dungeons more than ever before, I think also makes it even harder for new people to start getting into the game and understanding the game, and keep having new players coming into the system to keep it vibrant and fresh. But let me know what you guys think. Thank you so much for watching, and huge love to our patrons who make all of this content possible. If you'd like to join and get access to new videos, be sure to check it out in the description down below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.